Clara Ashworth pressed her fingernails into her palm so hard she felt the skin break, not from anger, but to stop herself from crying in front of them again. Eleanor held up the faded dress like it was something pulled from a rag pile and said without lowering her voice, "You cannot honestly intend to wear that to the Hartwell estate." Margaret laughed first. The maid looked away. And Clara the daughter, no one introduced the sister. No one claimed, lifted her chin, and said nothing. She had learned that silence held long enough becomes armor. If this story already has your heart, subscribe to our channel. Follow Clara's journey all the way to the end and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning of the Hartwell gathering. Clara Ashworth rose before the sun touched the floorboards, not out of excitement, out of habit. Because in the Ashworth household, the hours before her sisters woke were the only hours that belonged entirely to her. She built the kitchen fire herself. She drew the water herself. She pressed Eleanor's blue silk gown with hands that had stopped trembling years ago, not because the pain had left, but because she had simply run out of the energy to let it show. When Eleanor finally descended the staircase, she did not say good morning. She said, "The sash is uneven on the left side. Do it again." Clara did it again. Margaret appeared 20 minutes later, trailing the scent of rosewater, holding out her cream gloves for Clara to button without being asked. Margaret never asked. She simply extended her hand and waited, the way a woman extends a hand to a servant who has been trained not to hesitate. Clara buttoned the gloves. Their father, George Ashworth, sat at the head of the breakfast table, reading a letter of no particular importance, though he held it as though it contained the fate of nations. He was a man constructed almost entirely of posture. He had a fine coat, a firm handshake, and absolutely nothing behind either. "The Hartwell gathering tonight," he said without looking up. "I expect the two of you to conduct yourselves with distinction. The two of you." Clara stood at the sideboard pouring coffee. She did not turn around. "And Clara," her father added, and here he did look up briefly, as though remembering something he had misplaced. "You will attend. Mrs. Hartwell has extended the invitation to the whole of the family. It would be conspicuous if you were absent." Eleanor set down her fork with a small, deliberate clink. "Conspicuous?" she repeated in the tone she used when she wanted to say something cruel, without the accountability of cruelty. "Yes, I suppose it would be." Margaret smiled at her coffee cup. Clara said, "Yes, father," and went back to pouring. The Ashworth carriage was old, but maintained. Clara saw to that, along with everything else that kept the household from falling into the visible ruin it had been quietly approaching for 3 years, since their mother died. Since their father's business interests had grown more theoretical than actual. Since Eleanor the eldest had decided that managing appearances was a full occupation, and that Clara, being the youngest and the least marriageable by her own sustained campaign of diminishment, was best suited to managing everything else. The dress was the final insult of the morning. Clara had known for 2 weeks that she had nothing appropriate. She had told herself it did not matter. She had told herself this gathering was an obligation, not an opportunity, and that she would stand quietly near a wall and endure it the same way she endured everything, by being present in body and somewhere else entirely in her mind. But Eleanor had found the dress anyway, had held it up in the light of the dressing room doorway, and performed her verdict for an audience of Margaret and the housemaid Ruth, who had the grace to look at the floor. "This is genuinely all you have," Eleanor said. "It's clean," Clara said. "It's an embarrassment." Eleanor dropped it onto the bed like something dead. "If someone asks, I will tell them you are the seamstress's daughter. If someone asks," Clara said, picking it up and smoothing it flat, "I will tell them the truth." Eleanor looked at her with something that was not quite contempt. Contempt requires a kind of energy Eleanor reserved for things that mattered. It was closer to bewilderment, the same expression she had worn since childhood, when Clara refused to cry. "Suit yourself," Eleanor said, and swept out. Margaret lingered in the doorway. She was softer than Eleanor in surface only. Her cruelties were quieter, which made them somehow harder to deflect. "You know he won't look at you," Margaret said. not unkindly, almost gently. Adrian Hartwell has met every eligible woman in 3 counties. Women with property, women with connections, women with... She paused, and her eyes moved over Clara with the clinical detachment of an appraiser. Everything that signifies. I know, Clara said. Then why bother coming? Clara smoothed the last wrinkle from the dress with the flat of her hand. Because father said to, she said. And because I have never required the possibility of reward to do what is required of me. Margaret left without answering. Clara stood alone in the dressing room and looked at herself in the cracked mirror for exactly 3 seconds. She did not assess. She did not lament. She had made a private agreement with herself long ago that she would not spend her limited time on earth cataloging her own deficiencies. She had a mind. She had steady hands. She had the kind of spine that years of being underestimated either destroys or tempers into something that cannot be bent. She braided her hair herself, pinned it herself, and went downstairs. The Hartwell estate was 11 miles from town, and the ride was long enough for Eleanor to conduct a quiet rehearsal of all the things Clara should not do. Do not speak unless spoken to directly. Do not contradict anyone at the table. Do not discuss books. Men find it exhausting. Do not make father look worse than he already. She stopped herself, smoothed her gloves. Simply be quiet, Clara. That is the most useful thing you can offer. Margaret had fallen asleep against the carriage wall, which Clara envied. The ability to sleep through one's own family required a kind of moral spaciousness she had never quite developed. Eleanor, Clara said. What? Do you ever tire of it? Eleanor looked at her. Of what? Deciding what I am. It seems like a great deal of work for something that doesn't benefit you. The silence that followed was the kind Eleanor deployed when she did not have an answer she found flattering enough to speak aloud. She turned her face to the window instead, and Clara watched the darkening Virginia countryside move past in the last hour of light. She had not said it to wound. She had said it because she genuinely wanted to know. Because there was a part of her, not the armored part, not the quiet, useful part, but the part she kept so carefully contained that she sometimes forgot it existed, that still could not fully understand why her sisters had built so much of their identity around the project of reducing hers. She had never threatened them. She had never competed with them. She had simply existed, and apparently that had been enough. The Hartwell estate announced itself before it came into view, the line of lit torches along the approach road, the sound of carriage wheels and voices, the feeling of entering something that had been organized around the assumption of importance. Adrian Hartwell had inherited the estate at 26, when his father died of a fever that swept through the county the same year Clara's mother had died of the same. She had noted that coincidence once years ago and then filed it away in the part of her mind where she kept things that had no practical application. What she knew of him was what everyone knew, that he was 32 now, that he ran his land with a competence that inspired more genuine respect than the performative deference that usually passed for it in their county, that he had twice refused to foreclose on tenant farmers who had fallen behind during the hard winter of 1814, absorbing the loss himself without announcement or expectation of gratitude, that he had a reputation for listening before speaking, that so many men his age entirely lacked. She did not know him. She had seen him at church twice from a distance, and once at the magistrate's office when she had gone to file a document on her father's behalf, and he had held the door open and said, "Ma'am," with a directness that held no condescension in it, which she remembered because it was rarer than it should have been. She was not here in hope of him. She told herself this in the carriage, and then again when they arrived, and once more when Eleanor and Margaret stepped down into the torchlight ahead of her, immediately absorbed into the bright, warm current of arrivals and greetings, and the particular performance of people who had dressed for being seen. Clara stepped down last. No one greeted her. She had not expected anyone to. She followed her family inside. The gathering rooms were full, but not chaotic. The Hartwell staff had organized the evening with a quiet precision that Clara noticed immediately, the way she noticed all systems that worked well, because she was personally responsible for too many that didn't. The tables were set with an understated elegance. The candles were real beeswax, not tallow. The floors were clean, and the air smelled of something faintly herbal, like dried lavender under the general warmth of gathered people. Eleanor and Margaret were collected almost immediately into a circle of women near the front windows. Women of approximate social standing. The kind of gathering that formed and reformed at every event by some instinctive gravitational law. Clara drifted left toward the wall, toward the quieter edge of the room, where she could observe without being catalogued. It was her most practiced skill, and her most private one. She watched a man near the fireplace tell a story that was 80% gesture. She watched a young woman in a green dress who smiled at everything said to her and laughed at none of it, and recognized in the careful management of that expression something she understood from the inside. She watched an older couple near the far door who stood in perfect, comfortable silence beside each other, with the ease of people who have long since stopped needing to perform for one another, and felt something she would not name move briefly through her chest. She was so occupied in watching them that she did not realize she was being watched. She became aware of it the way you become aware of a sound that has been present for some time before you consciously register it suddenly, and with the retrospective certainty that it had been happening longer than you knew. She turned. Adrian Hartwell stood 12 feet away near the edge of the room's central space, speaking to a man she didn't recognize. Or he had been speaking. The other man was still talking. But Adrian Hartwell's attention had at some point redirected itself. It was directed at her. Not a glance. Not the sweep of a man cataloging the room's occupants. Something more deliberate than that. Something that had the quality of having chosen its object and settled there. He did not look away when she met his eyes. Clara held the look for 1 full second, which was 1 second longer than social propriety required, and 3 seconds shorter than she wanted, and she shut that thought down with the same efficient dispatch she applied to all thoughts of that category. She looked away first. Her heart, which she kept under extremely firm management, beat once hard against her sternum, as though registering a protest. She ignored it. She moved toward the far side of the room and found herself near a small table of books, decorative probably, but real, and picked one up and opened it to the middle and made herself read the same sentence 4 times before she registered what it said. It is by the steady application of attention that most of what is worth knowing becomes at last known. She closed the book. She put it back exactly where she had found it, and she kept her eyes on the room and not on the man who had, for reasons she could not account for, looked at her the way most people in her life had never thought to look, as though there were something there that merited the looking. Dinner was announced at 9. The seating had been arranged. Clara did not need to examine it long to understand its logic. Her father near the center, where his maintained appearance could make its best argument. Eleanor to the right of the table's upper end, where the conversation would be best. Margaret placed with deliberate calculation in the third seat of a promising cluster. Clara was placed at the far end. She sat down, unfolded her napkin with the same hands that had ironed everyone else's clothes that morning, and looked at her plate. A woman across from her, Mrs. Pruitt, she thought a county commissioner's wife, assessed her dress in one practiced glance, and then arranged her expression into the kind of polite disinterest that was itself a verdict. Clara looked at her plate. Then she heard Eleanor's voice carry down the table, not raised, not pointing, just perfectly projected, the way Eleanor had always spoken, knowing exactly how far sound traveled. She has always been the sensitive one. She prefers her own company. Don't take it personally if she seems distant. It isn't rudeness. It is simply her nature. A murmur of understanding. Of course, the distant, sensitive sister. Margaret supportively. She has always been better suited to quiet work. She writes, you know. Small things. Laughter gentle and dismissive, the kind that doesn't require a joke. Clara's napkin was folded in her lap, with a crease so sharp it could have served as a weapon. She breathed in through her nose. She breathed out. She kept her face still, and then from the head of the table came a voice. Not loud. Adrian Hartwell never needed to be loud. He simply spoke in the particular register of a man who had learned that a room will quiet itself for someone who does not beg for its attention. That is not what I observed. The table shifted. Not dramatically. Just a subtle collective reorientation, the way a field of wheat turns in a new wind. Eleanor's expression moved once quickly and then resettled. I beg your pardon, she said pleasantly. I said that is not what I observed. He did not look at Eleanor when he said it. He was cutting a piece of bread with the calm efficiency of a man whose attention was entirely accounted for. From what I could see earlier this evening, she was the only person in this room who was actually watching it. The rest of us were performing for one another. She was paying attention. A silence. Not an uncomfortable one, a clarifying one. Clara did not look up immediately. She waited until she trusted her face. Then she raised her eyes and found that he had, with the same unhurried deliberateness, already looked away toward the man to his left, who was now attempting to recover the thread of a political conversation that had lost its footing. Clara looked at her plate again. Her hands were completely steady. Her heart was doing something she did not have a prepared category for. She picked up her fork. She ate her dinner. And at the far end of the Hartwell table, in a faded dress that had survived more than her sister's cruelty, Clara Ashworth sat straight-spined and clear-eyed and ate every course that was set before her, not as a woman who did not belong, but as a woman who had simply not yet been correctly identified. The distinction mattered. She had always known it. Tonight, for the first time, someone else had seen it too. The dinner ended the way most things in Clara Ashworth's life ended, quietly, without ceremony, and with her doing the work of managing her own invisibility so efficiently that no one noticed the effort required. She folded her napkin. She pushed back her chair. She stood and moved away from the table in the practiced way of a woman who had learned to exit spaces before she could be formally dismissed from them. Eleanor did not look up. Margaret was already laughing at something a young man to her left had said, her hand placed with mathematical precision on his sleeve. Their father raised his wineglass in Clara's general direction, which was his version of acknowledgment. She walked toward the far side of the gathering room, where the evening had begun its slow migration from formal to informal, smaller conversations. Couples drifting toward the doors that opened onto the rear of the house. Older men clustering near the hearth with their bourbon and their certainties. She found a chair near the east wall, not quite hidden, not quite present, and sat in it with the posture of a woman who had decided that the evening had given her everything it was going to give, and she was content to wait out the remainder in peace. She was wrong about that. She was wrong in a way that would take her several years to fully appreciate. It began with Mrs. Pruitt. The commissioner's wife materialized at Clara's elbow with the smooth inevitability of a woman on a social mission carrying 2 glasses of lemonade as a pretense of generosity. Miss Ashworth, she said, setting one glass on the small table beside Clara's chair, with the practiced warmth of a woman who had decided that Clara merited closer examination. You must be finding all of this rather overwhelming. Clara took the lemonade. I find it interesting, she said. Thank you for the drink. Interesting. Mrs. Pruitt sat in the adjacent chair and arranged her skirts with a small settling sound. Your sisters are having a lovely evening. They usually do. And you? Mrs. Pruitt paused in the particular way that signals what follows has been prepared in advance and is simply waiting for its cue. You are the youngest. I confess I don't recall seeing you at many of these occasions. I'm often occupied at home, Clara said. Of course, managing a household is demanding work. Something in her tone curved very slightly like a smile with a barb tucked under its edge. Your mother's passing must have left a great deal on your shoulders. Clara looked at her, not with heat, just with the clear, flat attention she turned on things she wanted to understand completely. It left what it left, she said. I managed it. Mrs. Pruitt studied her for a moment, recalibrating. Then she smiled, the warmer version this time, the one that meant she had found something unexpected and was not entirely displeased. "You're not at all what I expected," she said. "What did you expect, honestly?" She tilted her head. "What your sisters described." Clara felt the familiar compression in her chest. Not pain exactly, more like the feeling of a space being made smaller by exterior pressure, a sensation she recognized so well that she had long ago stopped being surprised by it. "And what did they describe?" she said. "A girl who needed protecting from herself." Mrs. Pruitt said it without cruelty, which somehow made it worse. Fragile, prone to sentiment, the sort who mistakes emotion for argument. The lemonade in Clara's glass was sweet and cold, and she focused on that for exactly 1 second. "That is not accurate," she said. "No," Mrs. Pruitt agreed. "I can see that." A pause opened between them, the kind that could go in several directions. Then Mrs. Pruitt rose, smoothed her skirts, and said with the particular tone of a woman who has made a private decision and does not feel obligated to explain it. "Mr. Hartwell asked after you, you know. Before dinner." Clara's hand stilled on the glass. "He asked your name," Mrs. Pruitt said simply. "I thought you should know." And then she moved away into the crowd, leaving Clara sitting very still in her chair, with the lemonade growing warm in her hand. He had asked her name, before dinner, before the table, before the comment that had stilled the room. He had seen her near the books, and he had asked someone her name. Clara set the glass down with absolute precision, as though the steadiness of that single action could stand in for the steadiness she was working to maintain everywhere else. She breathed. She told herself it meant nothing, which was not an entirely honest thought, but was a useful one, and she held on to it with both hands. She did not notice, because she was working very hard on not noticing, that across the room, Adrian Hartwell was no longer where he had been. 10. She found the library by accident. That was what she told herself afterward. And it was approximately true. She had been looking for a quieter room somewhere she could stand for 10 minutes without being assessed. And the door had been slightly ajar. And she was the sort of person who had never in her life been able to walk past an open door without wanting to know what was on the other side. The room was lit by a single lamp on the central table, which meant someone had been there recently, or was there still, and she had stepped inside and breathed in the smell of old paper and leather, and the specific quietness that accumulates in rooms where serious reading happens, and she had been 3 steps in before she registered the figure standing at the far shelf. He had a book open in his left hand and a glass in his right, and he did not hear her come in, or if he did, he gave no indication of it, and she had stood very still for a moment, with the acute social discomfort of a person who has entered a space they have no legitimate claim to, and disturbed someone who had prior occupation of it. She turned to leave. "You don't have to go," he said. She turned back. He had closed the book, one finger keeping his place, and was looking at her with the same quality of attention she had noticed earlier. Not searching, not evaluating, simply present the way very few people were entirely present when they looked at you. "I didn't mean to intrude," she said. "You didn't." He set the glass down on the shelf beside him. "I came here for the same reason I suspect you did. To be somewhere that doesn't require a performance." Clara looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "You're the host." "Yes. Hosts are generally understood to be performing by definition." The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was the precursor of one. "That's accurate," he said. "And exhausting. Would you like to sit?" She should have said no. Every piece of social reasoning she possessed told her clearly that she should have declined, thanked him, and returned to her chair by the east wall to continue her competent management of the evening's remaining hours. She sat in the chair nearest the window. He sat in the chair across from her, opened his book again briefly, then seemed to reconsider, and set it on the table between them. "You were reading it," she said. "I've read it before." He nodded toward it. "I was reading it again because there's a section I've been arguing with for approximately 3 years, and I haven't won yet." "What section?" He looked at her, as though the question itself had confirmed something. "Burke's position on inherited obligation," he said. He argues that a man's responsibility to his estate is indistinguishable from his responsibility to those who depend on it. I find it mostly correct, but structurally incomplete. Incomplete how? Because it accounts for obligation downward and not laterally. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on knees, the posture of a man who had forgotten for a moment that he was supposed to be performing a host. He describes what a man owes to those beneath him in the structure, but he doesn't address what he owes to those beside him, equals, neighbors. The woman in the faded dress who runs her father's household and receives no accounting in any framework he bothered to construct. The last phrase landed between them with a weight that neither of them immediately addressed. Clara felt something move in her chest that was not the same thing she had felt earlier. Earlier had been surprise. This was something quieter and more dangerous, the particular sensation of being seen accurately, which she had so rarely experienced that she almost didn't recognize it. He wasn't writing about women, she said. He should have been. Adrian said it without heat, just the calm certainty of a man stating a position he'd arrived at through thought rather than sentiment. That is a radical thing to say in present company, Clara said, or any company in my experience. I'm aware. He picked up his glass. I'm generally right about things people find inconvenient, which has made me rather unpopular in certain circles. And yet you appear to be the most attended man in the county. Attendance, he said, is not the same as popularity. People attend what is useful. They like what is comfortable. He looked at her. You understand that distinction better than most, I suspect. Clara's hands were folded in her lap with a stillness she was working for. I understand most distinctions well, she said. It's one of the benefits of being overlooked. You have a great deal of time to observe. What did you observe tonight? He said. Before dinner. I saw you watching the room. She looked at him directly the way she rarely allowed herself to look at people, because she had learned that directness from women in her position was frequently mistaken for boldness or desperation, neither of which she had ever been. I observed, she said carefully, that most of the people in that room were talking to the idea of you rather than to you, performing for a position they wanted to occupy in your estimation. She paused. And that you were aware of it and were managing your awareness with rather more patience than I would have had. He was quiet for a moment. What else? He said. The couple near the far door, she said. The older ones. They didn't speak for most of the evening. They didn't need to. That is the only thing in that room tonight that looked entirely real. Adrian Hartwell looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read, which was unusual for her. That's my aunt and her husband, he said. They've been married 31 years. It shows, Clara said. Is that what you want? He said. 31 years of that. The question was too direct and too sudden and too honest for the social context in which it had been asked, and she felt it land in her chest like a stone dropped into still water, the rings of it spreading outward before she could stop them. I want, she said, and stopped and recalibrated because she had been about to say something true, which was almost always inadvisable. I want what most people want. To be known accurately. To have that knowledge held with care. She met his eyes. Whether that takes 31 years or 31 minutes, I'm less concerned with the duration than the quality. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, Mrs. Pruitt told you I asked your name. It was not a question. Yes, Clara said. I would have told you myself, he said. But you were on the other side of the room, and then dinner was called, and the moment passed. And then you addressed the table, she said. I addressed an inaccuracy, he said. About me. About what was being said in your hearing about you. Yes. He held her gaze. I won't apologize for it. I didn't ask you to, Clara said. I was going to thank you, actually, though I'm not certain whether thanks are appropriate for someone telling the truth. They shouldn't have to be, he said. The truth should be the baseline. The thanks are for the rarity. Clara looked at him and thought, this is the most honest conversation I have had with another person in longer than I can precisely calculate. She thought that is either an indication of how exceptional he is or how impoverished my circumstances have been. She thought it was probably both. From somewhere in the house, music started. Someone at the pianoforte, tentative at first, and then more confident, a melody she half recognized. "That's the signal," Adrian said without much urgency, "that I'm expected back in the main room." "Then you should go," Clara said. He didn't move immediately. "You'll stay," he said. "I'll stay a few minutes," she said, "and then I'll return to my wall." "You shouldn't have a wall," he said. "Everyone has a wall," she said. "Mine is just more honestly named." He stood. He picked up the book and set it back on the shelf with the care of a man who respected what belonged on shelves. Then he paused, half-turned, and said, "Miss Ashworth." "Mr. Hartwell." "The section I've been arguing with." He gestured to the shelf. "Third from the left. If you read it tonight and find the structural weakness before I do, I'd appreciate knowing." He left. Clara sat in the chair for a moment with the absolute stillness of a woman who is deciding whether what just happened was real. Then she stood, crossed to the shelf, and pulled out the third book from the left. She read for 40 minutes. She found what she thought was the weakness in 25. She spent the remaining 15 minutes making sure she was right, because she had learned that the confidence of being correct required the same work as the fact of it, and she had never been willing to present half-finished thought as finished thinking. When she returned to the main room, Eleanor found her almost immediately. "Where have you been?" Eleanor's voice was pitched low, which was more frightening than the raised version. "Reading," Clara said. "Reading." Eleanor looked at her with the expression she reserved for things that had departed significantly from her expectations. "At a gathering." "In the library," Clara said. "Yes. You were in the library. That is where the books are." Eleanor's jaw moved in a way that suggested she was working through several possible responses and discarding them. Then she said, "Did you speak with anyone?" "Several people," Clara said. Which was not untrue. Mrs. Pruitt, and one other. "Anyone of consequence?" Clara thought about the word consequence. She thought about a man who had asked her name before he knew she was worth asking after. She thought about Burke, and inherited obligation, and 31 years of real silence. "That depends on how you define consequence," she said. Eleanor looked at her with a sudden sharp attention that Clara recognized. It was the look Eleanor got when she sensed something had shifted without her permission. "Clara," she said. "I'm tired," Clara said pleasantly. "I'd like to find Father and suggest we begin thinking about departure, unless you and Margaret need more time." Eleanor stared at her. "You look different," Eleanor said. "It's the same dress," Clara said. She moved past her sister into the crowd, and if her chin was perhaps a fraction higher than it had been 3 hours ago, she told herself that was simply good posture, and posture was one of the few things in her life she had always managed with complete and unimpeachable discipline. The Ashworth carriage rolled out of the Hartwell estate at 11:30, and Clara sat in her corner with her hands folded and her eyes on the dark countryside and did not speak. Margaret had fallen asleep again, which continued to inspire Clara's muted admiration. Eleanor sat across from her in the good lamplight and watched her with an attention that had a different quality to it than usual. Sharper, more careful. "He spoke to you at dinner," Eleanor said finally. It was not a question. "He corrected a statement," Clara said. "I was at the far end of the table. He said you were the only one paying attention." "He said the room wasn't paying attention," Clara said. "The distinction matters." "Don't be clever with me," Eleanor said. "I'm not being clever," Clara said. "I'm being accurate. There's a difference." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then, "You were in the library with him." Clara looked at her. "I was in the library. He happened to be there when I arrived." "Clara." Eleanor's voice had dropped to something almost genuine. Not kind, not exactly, but human in a way Eleanor didn't often permit herself in front of the family. "He is not a possibility for you." "I'm aware," Clara said. "He has half the county's mothers presenting daughters to him. Women with dowries and connections and—" "I know," Clara said. "Then what were you doing in that library for 40 minutes?" Clara turned to look at the window. "Reading?" she said simply. "I found a structural weakness in an argument Burke made about inherited obligation. I wanted to be sure I was right before I said so." The silence that followed had a quality Clara couldn't quite identify. "And were you?" Eleanor said finally. "Right?" Clara turned back from the window. "Yes," she said. "I was." She did not sleep well that night, which she attributed entirely to the coffee she'd had too late in the evening, and not at all to the fact that she lay awake in the dark, reconstructing a conversation she had not expected to have, examining it from different angles, the way she examined everything that mattered, turning it in her mind, the way you turn a stone in your hand to find all its surfaces. He had asked her name before he knew whether she was worth asking after. That kept returning to her, the sequence of it. Not he had noticed her after she had distinguished herself. Not he had spoken to her because the dinner table had made her suddenly visible, before. He had seen her standing at the edge of the room with her attention fully deployed, doing the work she always did of understanding a space before she entered it properly, and something in that posture or that attention had made him ask who she was. She had been seen in the act of seeing. That was the thing she couldn't put down. She turned onto her side and told herself firmly to sleep, and then lay awake for another hour, which she spent not thinking about it at all. 3 days later, a letter arrived. It was addressed to her father, which was standard and meant nothing. George Ashworth received letters regularly from people who had legitimate business with him, or who believed they had legitimate business with him, which was a somewhat shorter list. But her father opened this letter at breakfast, read it twice, and put it down on the table beside his coffee in a way that had the quality of a man who has received news he does not yet know how to hold. "Well," he said. Eleanor looked up from her toast. "The Hartwell estate," George said, "is extending an invitation to the family. A private visit. This Saturday." The table went very still in the way of 3 people each having completely different thoughts in the same moment. "A private visit," Eleanor said. "A dinner," George said. "Small party. The letter says—" He picked it up again, reading carefully. "A gathering of 6 or 8 informal for conversation and company." He set it down. "He's asking specifically that all family members attend." All family members. Margaret's eyes moved to Clara with the quick assessing dart of a woman recalculating. Eleanor's face moved through several expressions too fast for any one of them to settle. Clara reached for her coffee cup and drank from it with perfect steadiness, the way she did everything with the complete and practiced calm of a woman who had been surprised before and had learned through long experience that the most important thing was not the surprise itself, but what you did with your face in the moment of it. "All family members," Eleanor said, in a tone that was doing significant architectural work. "That's specific." "Yes," their father said. "Why would he—" Eleanor stopped herself. She smoothed her napkin. She reassembled her expression with the efficiency of a woman who has spent 20 years constructing the right face for every occasion. "We'll attend, of course, all of us." She said it firmly, the way you say a thing when you're not sure of the ground beneath it. Clara set her coffee cup down. She thought about Burke. She thought about structural incompleteness. She thought about a man who had held her gaze across a room full of people performing for him and had looked at her instead like she was something worth the looking. She thought I was right about the weakness in the argument. She thought I wonder if he found it himself or if he's asking to know. She thought neither of these things out loud, and she helped herself to another piece of bread, and she ate her breakfast with the same composure she brought to every morning, steady, quiet, entirely self-possessed. But something had changed in the Ashworth house on that Saturday morning, 3 days after the Hartwell gathering, and everyone at that table felt it, even if only Clara knew precisely what it was. The thing that had changed was this: she was no longer waiting. She had not been looking for anything. She had not hoped. She had not positioned herself or calculated or planned. She had simply sat in a library and been honest about what she thought, and had handed that honesty to a man who had received it with both hands. And now, in 3 days, she was going back. Not as the leftover daughter in the faded dress at the far end of the table. Not as the girl who managed the household while her sisters collected all the futures. As herself. Precisely, completely, and for the first time in a very long while, undeniably, herself. Eleanor was already planning her entrance. Margaret was already planning her smile. Their father was already planning his handshake and his carefully maintained manner. And Clara Ashworth, the youngest daughter, the quiet one, the one they had spent years reducing to something small and manageable, Clara was planning nothing. She already knew the argument. She had already found where it broke, and when the time came, she would say so. The week moved the way weeks move when you are simultaneously dreading and anticipating the same event, faster in its forward progress and agonizingly slow in its details. Clara noticed everything and showed nothing. She went about her usual work with her usual competence, the ironing and the accounts and the management of a household that ran on her labor and credited her for none of it. But there was something underneath the work now that had not been there before. Something with the character of a question she had not yet answered. On Thursday, she caught Eleanor watching her while she was mending a curtain hem in the sitting room. The look was not the usual assessment, not the quick cataloging glance of a woman measuring what Clara was or was not presenting to the world. It was more careful than that. More concerned in the particular way that Eleanor's concern had always expressed itself, which was to say, something has the potential to affect me, and I am calculating the extent. "You're in a different humor," Eleanor said finally. "Am I?" Clara said. Not a question. "You've been..." Eleanor searched for the word. "Present. More than usual." "I'm generally present," Clara said. "You know what I mean." Clara looked up from the curtain. "I know what you mean," she said. "And I don't know how to explain it, except to say that I feel for the first time in some years that the world is slightly larger than I thought it was." Eleanor looked at her for a long moment. "Be careful," she said. Clara returned to her mending. "I'm always careful," she said. "The difference is, I used to be careful in order to protect other people from inconvenience. I think now I might be careful for my own sake." She smoothed the hem flat with the tip of her thumb. "That's a different kind of careful. It's better." Eleanor left the room without responding. Clara kept mending, and the evening light came through the window and lay warm across her hands, and for the first time in years she did not notice the crack in the mirror across the room because she was not looking at it. She was looking at her hands, her steady, capable, entirely adequate hands. They were fine, she thought. They had always been fine. It had simply taken someone with the right quality of attention to make her remember that she had already known it. Saturday came with the indifferent punctuality of all things that matter. The Ashworth carriage was readied early. Eleanor had a new ribbon on her dress and wore it with the forward lean of someone prepared to win something. Margaret had spent 40 minutes on her hair, and the result was beautiful in the way that careful performance is always beautiful. Technically accomplished, slightly too deliberate. Their father had polished his boots and renewed his firm handshake with several practice repetitions against his own palm. Clara wore the same dress. She had pressed it herself the night before, put it on in the gray morning light. Looked at herself in the cracked mirror for exactly the same 3 seconds she always allowed herself, and made the same agreement she always made. She would not catalogue. She would not apologize. She would be exactly what she was. If that was not enough, she would know it certainly, and she would stop wondering. The carriage reached the Hartwell estate in the late afternoon, when the light was the long golden kind that makes everything look more truthful than it usually is, and Clara stepped down from it onto the Hartwell gravel and thought, here we are. Here then. All of it. Whatever came next. She was ready. She had in fact been ready for rather longer than anyone around her had ever bothered to notice. That was about to change. The Hartwell house received them differently the second time. Not the house itself. The house was the same, but the quality of being received in it was different, and Clara noticed the difference immediately, the way she noticed all things that had shifted without announcement. The staff knew their names. The door opened before her father had finished raising his hand to knock. A young woman in a gray dress took their wraps with the particular efficiency of someone who had been told which guests to expect and had prepared accordingly. Eleanor noticed it too. Clara could tell by the way her sister's chin lifted a precise fraction, the unconscious movement of a woman recalibrating her own position in a space that had already organized itself around information she did not yet have. Their father noticed nothing, except that the entry was warm and well lit, which satisfied his requirements for a good evening. Margaret was already composing her expression for maximum effect, which was the thing she was genuinely best at, and which Clara had never begrudged her because it was honest labor in its way, even if the product was a kind of beautiful fiction. Adrian Hartwell was not in the entrance hall. He came from the interior of the house from the direction of what Clara now knew was the library, with the unhurried directness of a man who did not believe in performing a rival any more than he believed in performing anything else. He shook George Ashworth's hand with the brief firm grip of a man who was being courteous rather than deferential. He nodded to Eleanor with the correct degree of warmth. He smiled at Margaret with the polite appreciation of a man who recognized beauty without being redirected by it. Then he looked at Clara. "Miss Ashworth," he said, "did you find the weakness?" Eleanor's head turned. Margaret's smile froze at its edges. Their father looked mildly puzzled, which was his most common expression. Clara met Adrian's eyes with the composure she had spent 5 days constructing and said, "On page 112, he conflates the source of obligation with its direction. Obligation doesn't flow from above. It flows from relationship. He never accounts for that." Adrian Hartwell looked at her for a moment with an expression that Clara could only describe privately and with great discipline as satisfaction. "I found the same thing," he said. "On Thursday morning. I've been arguing with it since." "And," Clara said, "and I think you're right." He said it the way he said everything, without inflation, without the particular performance of a man graciously conceding a point to make a woman feel capable. Just the assessment. The truth. Delivered cleanly. Eleanor said, "I'm sorry, books." "Burke," Adrian said, turning to include her with the easy courtesy of a man who has finished one conversation and is beginning another. "A text I've been wrestling with. Your sister was kind enough to engage with it at the gathering last week." He gestured toward the interior of the house. "Please, the others are already gathered in the sitting room. I believe Mrs. Pruitt and her husband are already arguing about something, which means the evening is off to a promising start." He led them through, and Clara, walking in the wake of her family, as she always did, felt Eleanor's hand close briefly around her arm, not hard, not cruel, just the quick grip of a woman who needed a second to recalibrate and then release. Clara said nothing. She walked forward. The small party was 8 people, the Ashworths. Mrs. Pruitt and her husband, the commissioner. A man named Thomas Beale, who was some kind of legal associate of Adrian's, and a quiet older woman introduced as Mrs. Hartwell, his mother. It turned out, which was a detail that reconfigured the evening's stakes in ways Clara spent the first 20 minutes quietly calculating. A man did not invite a woman's family to a private dinner with his mother unless something had already been decided in his mind, or unless he was in the process of deciding it and wanted the cleaner information that smaller, more honest gatherings produce. Clara had not allowed herself to think that. She allowed herself to think it now briefly, and then filed it away in the part of her mind labeled things that may or may not be true and require more evidence. The sitting room conversation moved the way conversation moves in small gatherings, where everyone has been placed with intention. Topics introduced and redirected alliances, forming and reforming over the course of 20 minutes. Commissioner Pruitt held a firm opinion about the new land survey legislation and was prepared to defend it at length. Thomas Beale was dry and precise, and had the particular quality of a man who listens before he speaks, and therefore tends to say things worth hearing. Mrs. Hartwell Sr. sat near the window with a glass of wine and an expression of alert, measuring calm that Clara recognized from her own mirror. Eleanor had positioned herself in direct conversational proximity to Adrian within 4 minutes of entering the room. It was a masterly piece of social navigation, and Clara could not help but acknowledge its technical excellence, even as she moved to the other side of the room and sat beside Mrs. Hartwell Sr., which was either the least strategically valuable position in the room or the most depending on how you interpreted the evening's actual architecture. "You're the one from the library," Mrs. Hartwell said. She did not say it as a question. "I was in the library at the gathering, yes," Clara said. "He told me about it." She sipped her wine. "He said you found his copy of Burke and read it for 40 minutes. 43, Clara said. I wanted to be certain before I said anything. Mrs. Hartwell looked at her. The woman was in her 60s, probably with the face of someone who had spent those decades paying close attention to things other people overlooked and had developed a fairly precise internal instrument for evaluating what she found. "He says you identified the structural problem." "I believe I did, yes." "He says you were right." "He confirmed that this evening," Clara said, "though I'd reached the conclusion independently." The corner of Mrs. Hartwell's mouth moved. "Are you always this direct?" "I'm always this accurate," Clara said. "The directness is a side effect." Mrs. Hartwell laughed. It was a real laugh, short and genuine, the kind that surprises even the person producing it. "My son," she said more quietly, setting down her glass, "has met a great many women in the last several years. His father left him the estate at 26, and every family in 3 counties has had an opinion about what he should do with his personal future ever since." She looked at Clara with the frank assessment of a woman who no longer had patience for indirection. "He has been unfailingly courteous and absolutely immovable. I've watched him deflect intelligent women, beautiful women, well-connected women, all with the same pleasant efficiency." She paused. "He has mentioned you 3 times since the gathering last week." Clara did not move. 3 times, Mrs. Hartwell said. "I counted, because I had stopped counting after 2 years of never once." Clara breathed, carefully. "I see," she said. "I thought you might," Mrs. Hartwell said, and picked up her wine again, and turned the conversation without warning to the topic of the land survey legislation, which she had opinions about, that made Commissioner Prewitt look like a mild enthusiast by comparison. Clara sat beside her and contributed when asked, and kept her face entirely composed, and felt somewhere beneath the composure the sensation of ground that had seemed solid for years, quietly rearranging itself into something new. Dinner was smaller and less formal than the gathering had been, which meant the conversations were harder to manage from a distance and easier to hear in full. Clara was placed not at the far end, but in the middle of the table across from Thomas Beale, 2 seats down from Adrian. Close enough to hear clearly, close enough to be heard. Eleanor had not been consulted on the seating, which was not lost on her. Clara could see the small adjustment her sister made, the way Eleanor shifted her shoulders, squared her spine, and decided in real time to make the best of a configuration she had not arranged. It was in its way an impressive display of adaptability. Margaret was seated beside Thomas Beale, which was genuinely kind of Adrian, because Beale was handsome in a precise bookish way that Margaret could appreciate, and he was asking her polite questions about her life with the genuine curiosity of a man who had not yet decided how interesting she was and was willing to find out. Commissioner Prewitt was telling a story about the survey legislation that had apparently reached its 3rd chapter. His wife was listening with the patient love of a woman who has heard this story many times and has decided that hearing it again is a reasonable price for the life she has built with the man telling it. Clara watched all of it in the brief moments she was not being spoken to directly. Adrian spoke to her 3 times during the first course. Small, direct, content-focused questions that had the quality of a man continuing a conversation that had been paused rather than starting a new one. "Do you think the obligation framework can be repaired, or does it need to be rebuilt from the ground? Repaired, Clara said. The foundation is sound. The direction of the argument is wrong, not the principle. I agree, he said. Anne turned to respond to something the commissioner had said, and then turned back and said, "What would the correct direction look like to you?" Lateral before vertical, Clara said. You establish what you owe to those at the same level before you can honestly account for what you owe to those above or below. Otherwise, the whole structure is built on an assumption about hierarchy that it never examines. He was quiet for a second. That's going to require me to revise 3 years of notes, he said. I know, she said. I'm sorry. I'm not, he said. And his eyes held hers for a moment longer than the exchange required, and Clara looked away first again and attended to her plate with the focused calm of a woman who is managing several things simultaneously and doing it very well. Eleanor had heard the exchange. Clara knew by the quality of silence to her left. It was the specific silence of a woman who is listening and thinking and revising her understanding of a situation she believed she had already fully mapped. The second course arrived. The conversation shifted and broadened. Beale made a dry observation about the Virginia land courts that made Adrian laugh, a real laugh, short and unguarded, the kind that changes a person's face entirely, and Clara filed that away too, in the part of her mind that was quietly accumulating evidence for a conclusion she was not yet ready to name. Then Eleanor spoke. She did it beautifully. Clara had to acknowledge that. Eleanor had always been the most architecturally skilled member of their family, the one who could build a sentence that did 3 things at once: compliment, undercut, and position all in the space of a single social breath. Adrian, Eleanor said with the pleasant warmth of long familiarity that they had not in fact established, but that she was projecting into existence through sheer force of manner. I hope my sister hasn't been monopolizing your intellectual attention. She does tend to, how do I put it, attach herself to a subject and not let go. It can be rather overwhelming for people who haven't encountered it before. A small silence. Not the clarifying kind, the held breath kind. I hadn't noticed any of those qualities, Adrian said pleasantly. His tone was even unreadable, the practiced neutrality of a man who has been in enough rooms to know that some statements require a very precise response and some require none at all. I've noticed she thinks carefully before she speaks, which I find useful in a conversation partner. Of course, Eleanor said, smooth as water. We've always said she was the thoughtful one. Have you? Adrian said. Just that, 2 words, flat and clear as a blade laid on a table. Eleanor's smile held. Barely. Margaret was very interested in her fork. Clara kept her eyes on Beale, who had the social grace to reinitiate the conversation about the land courts, which he did with the skill of a man who had spent years extracting people from difficult moments. But, under the table, Clara's hands were in her lap, pressed flat against her thighs, and she was making herself breathe at the exact tempo she always breathed at, which was taking considerably more concentration than usual. Because something had happened across that dinner table that had never happened before in her 24 years of sitting at tables where her sisters controlled the architecture of her reputation. Someone had refused to accept the architecture, not argued against it, not defended her, simply refused. Treated the offered version of her like a map he already knew was wrong, and consulted instead the territory he had observed with his own eyes. She had not known until this moment how much weight she had been carrying in the assumption that no one would ever do that. She pressed her hands flatter against her thighs. She breathed. She ate her dinner. After the meal, the party moved to the sitting room again, and the informal dispersion that followed gave Eleanor the opening she had been waiting for the entire evening. Clara was near the window, the same window where Mrs. Hartwell Sr. had stationed herself, though the older woman had moved now to speak with Commissioner Pruitt when Eleanor appeared at her shoulder. With the silent suddenness of a woman who had spent years materializing in spaces Clara thought she'd found alone. You need to stop, Eleanor said quietly, directly, without the usual performance. Clara turned to look at her. Stop what? She said. Whatever you think is happening here. Eleanor's voice was low and controlled, and had under it something that Clara could only identify as fear, not for Clara, but of something Clara was doing or about to do that Eleanor could feel but not yet name. He is being polite. He is an intelligent, courteous man who finds intellectual conversation stimulating. That is not... She stopped, restarted. That is not what you are making it into. I'm not making it into anything, Clara said. You are looking at him? Eleanor said. He is part of the room. Clara? She said it hard the way she'd said it when they were children, and something had gone wrong. He is the most eligible man in 3 counties. He has been presented with every suitable woman available, and he has chosen none of them. His mother is calculating. His associates are watching. And you are... She stopped herself again, and something crossed her face that was raw enough to be honest. You are going to get hurt, and I cannot... Eleanor, Clara said. Her sister stopped. I know you believe that, Clara said. I know you believe what you've always believed, which is that I am the least likely of us to receive anything the world considers valuable. She kept her voice low and even, and entirely steady. I have spent most of my life managing my expectations in exactly the way you're describing. Managing them so well that I nearly talked myself out of going to the library that night because I couldn't find a sufficiently logical justification for wanting to. Eleanor stared at her. I'm not making anything into something it isn't, Clara said. I am simply for the first time not making it into something it isn't the other way either. She held her sister's gaze. I don't know what this is, but I know what it's not. It's not nothing. Eleanor opened her mouth, closed it. Something moved across her face that Clara could not fully read. It was too complex, too layered with things Eleanor had spent years compressing into the narrow, manageable space of a woman who had decided early that certain feelings were not useful and had been working ever since to keep them that way. Be careful, Eleanor said, for the second time. But this time it sounded different. Less like a warning about the world, and more like something that had slipped through from somewhere deeper. Something almost tender in the broken, inadequate way that care expresses itself in people who have forgotten how to be tender. I know, Clara said. I will. Eleanor moved away, and Clara stood by the window and let the conversation flow around her, and thought about what her sister had just almost said, and what it would have taken for Eleanor to say it cleanly, and whether 20 years of damage could be undone by wanting to undo it. She didn't have an answer, but she filed the question carefully in the part of her mind she kept for things that mattered. It was Thomas Beale who found her first. He appeared beside her with the quiet of a man accustomed to occupying the edges of rooms professionally attorneys in Clara's experience were either the loudest person present or the one you forgot was there until they said something that changed the entire shape of the conversation. Beale was the second kind. You argued him to a draw on Burke, he said without preamble. In 40 minutes. I had the book, Clara said. He's had the book for 3 years, Beale said. The book wasn't the variable. Clara looked at him. He had the face of a man who found precision more interesting than comfort, which she generally considered a reliable indicator of character. How long have you known Mr. Hartwell? She said. 11 years, since law school. He sipped his drink. Long enough to know what his ordinary evenings look like, and to notice when one doesn't. And this one doesn't. He has invited the same core 7 or 8 people to this house for the last 4 years, Beale said, with minor variation for specific occasions. You are a significant departure from the pattern. He paused. The invitation was his idea. He mentioned it to me before it was sent. Clara kept her face entirely still. He said... Beale continued with the precision of a man reading from an internal document that he had met someone who thought before she spoke and meant what she said when she said it, and he would like to know if that observation held in a second context. He set down his glass. I am apparently the context checker. He asked me what I thought. And what do you think? Clara said. I think Beale said that observation holds. He said it with the flat finality of a legal ruling, and moved away toward the commissioner, leaving Clara standing with the weight of it. He had told his closest friend before sending the letter. Not after. Before. He had been certain enough to tell someone before he had confirmation she would come. Clara breathed in through her nose. She breathed out. She thought, I am not misreading this. She thought I have been so careful for so long not to misread things that I almost missed reading this one correctly. She did not let herself think beyond that. Not yet. Not here. Not with Eleanor across the room watching. Bell. The moment came at the end of the evening, in the natural dispersal of a small party, preparing to depart, the retrieving of wraps, the exchange of farewells, the careful social choreography of leave-taking. Adrian walked them to the door. This was normal, expected, a host's courtesy. But at the door, while George Ashworth was engaged in a last exchange with Commissioner Pruitt about the survey legislation, and Margaret was accepting her wrap from the staff member who had taken it, and Eleanor was standing with precise awareness 3 feet to Clara's left. Adrian said to Clara, specifically in the tone of a man completing a sentence that had been left open for 5 days, I'll return the Burke when I've finished revising the notes, though I suspect the revisions will take some time. I'm not in any hurry, Clara said. That's useful to know, he said. His eyes were direct. His voice was even. I'm not certain I'm in any hurry either. And then George Ashworth finished his conversation and turned back, and the moment closed over itself, like water closing over a stone, smooth and immediate, and they were all 4 Ashworths moving down the steps toward the carriage. But the stone had fallen, and the rings of it were already spreading out across everything quiet and inevitable and entirely unstoppable in the dark Virginia night. In the carriage, no one spoke for several minutes. Their father fell asleep inside of 4. Margaret was looking out the window with an expression that Clara could not see clearly in the dark, but that had the posture of someone rearranging their understanding of something they had already been fairly certain about. Then Eleanor said, not loudly, not harshly, but into the particular quiet of the carriage in a way that made it unavoidable. Clara. Yes, Clara said. He came to stand beside you 3 separate times this evening. Not near you. Beside you. There's a difference. I know, Clara said. His mother watched you for most of dinner. I know, Clara said. Beale spoke to you for 6 minutes while the rest of the room was otherwise occupied. Eleanor, I've spent 20 years deciding what you are, Eleanor said, and her voice had something in it that was neither judgment nor apology, but was some third thing that existed in the space between them, something that had no clean name in the vocabulary they had built for each other. And I think... She stopped. The carriage rolled over a rough patch of road, and the sound of it filled the silence for a moment. I think I may have made an error in my accounting. Clara said nothing. Not all of it, Eleanor said quickly. Too quickly. The quickness of a woman who is being honest for the first time in a long while, and finding it less comfortable than she expected. But some of it. The library, for instance. I told you reading at a gathering was... She stopped again. It wasn't inappropriate. It was entirely, you and I said it as though that were a fault. It is entirely me, Clara agreed. Yes, Eleanor said. I know. The carriage rolled on through the warm Virginia dark. Their father snored softly. Margaret continued looking out her window. And Clara sat across from her oldest sister, the woman who had spent the better part of 2 decades being wrong about her, in the specific, costly way that people are wrong when they need to be, and felt something shift, not forgiveness exactly, not yet, perhaps not ever entirely, but an acknowledgment. A door slightly open in a wall that had been solid for years. I'm not making promises, Eleanor said finally. I don't know how to do this differently. I know, Clara said. But I might. Eleanor looked out the window. I might try to be less certain about some things. Clara looked at her sister's profile in the dark. That, she said quietly, is the most important thing you've ever said to me. Eleanor made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a cry and was somehow both, and Clara looked back out her own window at the Virginia dark moving past the fields and the fences and the long road back to Ashworth Manor and thought about a man who had stood beside her 3 times and meant something different by it than standing near someone, and thought about stone dropped in water, and thought about the rings. She let herself feel it, all of it, just for a moment, and then she breathed it back to steadiness, the way she always did, and held the steadiness, like something precious, all the way home. Because she was not finished yet. She was in fact just beginning. The letter came on a Tuesday. Not addressed to her father this time, addressed to her. Clara was at the kitchen table when Ruth brought it in, still holding the bread she had been slicing, and she set the bread down and looked at the envelope for a moment before she picked it up. Not because she was afraid of it, but because she wanted to receive it correctly. The way you receive something you have been moving toward, without knowing you were moving toward it until it is suddenly in your hand. Her name was written in a clear, direct hand. No ornamentation, no excessive formality. Just Miss Clara Ashworth, the way you write a name when you are thinking of the person, not the title. She opened it. It was 2 pages. She read both of them twice, standing at the kitchen table, and then folded them carefully, and put them back in the envelope, and held the envelope with both hands for a moment, the way you hold something fragile. He had written about Burke first. He had found 2 additional structural problems she had not identified, and he laid them out with the clean logical progression of a man who thought on paper, the same way he thought aloud directly, without performance, tracing the argument to its end, before presenting the conclusion. He asked whether she agreed. He said she was under no obligation to agree, and that disagreement in his experience produced better results than consensus. Then he had written, "I am aware that this letter exceeds the conventional distance appropriate to our acquaintance. I am writing it anyway, because I find I am less interested in convention than in accuracy, and the accurate thing is that I have not had a conversation of equal quality in longer than I can precisely remember. If you are willing, I would like to continue having them." That was all. No declaration, no pressure, no performance. Just the clean, honest statement of a man who had decided to say a true thing and trusted her to receive it without needing it dressed up. Clara stood at the kitchen table with the envelope in both hands and thought, this is what it feels like. She had not known until this moment that she had been waiting to know that. She put the letter in the pocket of her apron and went back to slicing bread. Eleanor came downstairs 20 minutes later and poured herself coffee and looked at Clara across the kitchen with the careful, recalibrated attention she had been deploying since the carriage ride home. She did not ask. Clara did not tell. Not yet. There were things that needed to remain her own for a while, and this was one of them. She wrote back that afternoon at the small desk in her room in the 2 hours between the household accounts and the evening meal. She wrote about Burke. She confirmed his 2 additional points and raised one he hadn't mentioned, a place where the argument's internal logic contradicted its stated premise, which she had noticed the first time and set aside as secondary, but now considered significant. She laid out her reasoning. Then she wrote, "I am also aware that this exchange exceeds convention. I find I am not particularly troubled by that, as conventions have generally been designed around assumptions about what women have to contribute to a conversation, and I have spent most of my life declining to organize myself around assumptions I find structurally incomplete." She reread it. She did not soften it. She sealed the envelope and gave it to Ruth to post before she could reconsider, because she had learned that reconsideration in her case was almost always a mechanism for self-reduction rather than genuine improvement, and she was working on distinguishing between the two. Ruth took the letter with a small private smile that she directed at the floor rather than at Clara. Clara noticed it anyway. "Ruth," she said. "Ma'am." "Thank you," Clara said, "for all the times you looked at the floor." Ruth looked up, surprised. "I saw it," Clara said simply. "All of it. I always did." Ruth held the letter a little more carefully after that, which Clara noted and appreciated and said nothing else about. His response came in 3 days. 3 days in which Eleanor watched her with the focused concern of a woman who has decided to stop managing a situation and finds herself uncertain what to do with her hands as a result. 3 days in which their father noticed nothing at all. 3 days in which Margaret asked her on the second evening with genuine curiosity that surprised them both. "Are you happy, Clara?" And Clara had looked at her youngest sister. No middle sister, she was the youngest, and thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I think I might be getting there," she said. Margaret nodded and went back to her embroidery, and did not say anything further, which was somehow the right response. His second letter was longer. He addressed her point about the internal contradiction with the delight of a man who has been handed exactly the argument he needed and didn't know he was missing. He said, "You've located the thing I have been circling for 3 years without being able to name." The premise undermines the conclusion because he never examined the premise. He simply inherited it. He wrote 3 more paragraphs about it, dense and clear and alive with the specific pleasure of an idea being properly examined, and Clara read all 3 paragraphs twice and felt the same pleasure mirror itself in her own chest, which was not a sensation she had often had the opportunity to experience. Then at the bottom of the second page he had written, "I would like to speak to you in person, not at a gathering, not at a dinner. If you would permit it, I would like to call at Ashworth Manor on Friday afternoon. If that is not convenient, tell me when would be." Clara read the last paragraph 4 times. Then she picked up her pen and wrote, "Friday afternoon is convenient. I will be in the garden at 2 o'clock. She sealed it before Eleanor came home from her visit to the Prewitt household, and she gave it to Ruth. And Ruth took it with the same careful hands. Eleanor found out on Thursday. Not from Clara, from Mrs. Prewitt, who had heard from someone who had heard from someone else, that Adrian Hartwell had been seen discussing plans for a call at Ashworth Manor, which was the particular velocity at which information traveled in a county where most people had nothing more interesting to think about. Clara was in the sitting room with the household accounts when Eleanor came in and closed the door behind her. She knew from the closing of the door. "He's calling on Friday," Eleanor said. "Yes," Clara said. She kept her eyes on the accounts. "You arranged it." "We corresponded, mutually." "You corresponded." Eleanor sat down across from her. Not in the punishing way, not with the architecture of managed cruelty. Just sat down, like a person who is tired. "How many letters?" "2 each. About Burke." "And related matters." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "Clara," she said, "you understand what it means when a man of his position calls privately." "I understand what it conventionally signals," Clara said. "Yes." "And you're comfortable with that?" Clara set down her pen. She looked at her sister directly. "Eleanor, I am 24 years old. I have run this household for 3 years without acknowledgment or assistance. I have managed father's accounts, maintained this property, and organized the lives of everyone in this family while being consistently described as the fragile, sensitive, unremarkable one." She kept her voice even, not hard, just clear. "A man of intelligence and integrity has, through his own observation and his own judgment, decided that I am worth knowing. He would like to call on Friday. I would like him to call on Friday." She picked up her pen again. "I am very comfortable with that." Eleanor sat across from her in silence for what felt like a long time. Then she said, "What do you need from me?" Clara looked up. "What?" she said. "On Friday." Eleanor's voice was careful, like someone placing weight on ice and testing it as they go. "What do you need me to do or not do?" Clara studied her sister's face. The genuine effort in it. The difficulty of it. The particular cost of a woman who has organized herself around a certain view of the world and is attempting in real time to reorganize. "Be elsewhere," Clara said gently. "Not in another country, just elsewhere. Let me have the garden at 2. Eleanor nodded. "I can do that," she said. She stood. She went to the door. She paused with her hand on the frame and said without turning around, "He looked at you the way James looked at me. Before." Her voice had something in it that Clara had not heard in years, something bruised and real and carefully kept. Before everything. She didn't explain what everything was. She didn't need to. Clara knew. There had been a man once, 6 years ago, and something had happened, and Eleanor had come home one evening with a closed face and had never opened it again on that subject. "I thought I was protecting you from it," Eleanor said, "from the expectation." "I know," Clara said softly. "I was wrong," Eleanor said, "just that." She walked out and closed the door quietly behind her. Clara sat in the sitting room for a moment without moving. Then she pressed her hand flat against the account book on the table and breathed through the complicated tenderness of a feeling she did not have a clean word for, something between forgiveness and grief, and the specific sorrow of understanding. Finally, that the people who shaped your wounds were carrying wounds of their own that they never figured out how to set down. She breathed. She picked up her pen. She finished the accounts. Sound. Friday came the way important things come, not with fanfare, but with the particular quality of an ordinary morning that has a different weight to it than ordinary mornings usually carry. Clara was in the garden at 1:45. She had told herself she would arrive at 2 exactly, and had been standing at the kitchen window watching the path to the garden gate since 1:30, which told her something about herself that she found simultaneously irritating and human. She wore the same dress. She had decided that specifically deliberately. Not because she had no alternative. She had one other dress that was presentable, the gray Sunday dress she kept in the back of the wardrobe. But she had decided to wear this one, the faded one, the one her sisters had catalogued and dismissed, because it was honest. Because she was not going to begin something by presenting a version of herself that required better circumstances to be sustained. If he was coming to see her, she wanted him to see her. He arrived at 2 o'clock with the same unhurried directness he brought to everything. She heard the gate and turned, and he was there. No elaborate preparation. No additional staff. Just Adrian Hartwell walking up the garden path in his weekday coat, like a man who had come to finish a conversation. "Miss Ashworth," he said. "Mr. Hartwell," she said. "You found the internal contradiction," he said by way of greeting, which was the most perfectly calibrated greeting she had ever received in her life. "You found 2 structural gaps," she said. "We're even." He looked at her in that way he had settled unhurried present, and then he said, "Walk with me." And she fell into step beside him, and they walked along the garden path in the warm Virginia afternoon and talked about Burke for 20 minutes. But it was not about Burke. It was never really about Burke. Burke was the language they had developed for talking to each other in the space before they had developed a better one, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so, which was its own kind of honesty. He asked about the household. She told him plainly the truth of it, the management, the accounts, the years of labor, and the absence of acknowledgment. She did not perform suffering. She simply described her life with the flat clarity of a woman reporting facts. He listened with the total quality of attention she had come to understand was his most characteristic feature, not waiting for his turn to speak, not preparing his response, just actually listening. "That's a great deal for one person," he said when she had finished. "It's what was required," she said. "Those aren't the same thing," he said. She looked at him. "That it was required doesn't mean it was right that it fell to you," he said. "Obligation doesn't only flow in one direction. You said that yourself about Burke." "I said it about Burke's argument," she said. "I'm applying it more broadly," he said. "I do that sometimes. Take an argument somewhere its author didn't intend. Is that philosophically defensible?" "I think good arguments survive being applied beyond their original scope," he said. "If they can't, the weakness was always in the argument." Clara thought about that for a moment. Then she said, "My sisters would not characterize the situation the way I just did." "I know," he said. "I've heard how your sisters characterize it." Something in his tone was carefully neutral, in a way that contained below the neutrality something that was not neutral at all. "Eleanor spoke to you," Clara said. "At the gathering. At the dinner." He paused. "Both times she spoke about you in a way designed to reduce what I was forming an opinion about. Both times it had the opposite effect." Clara stopped walking. He stopped beside her. "The opposite effect," she said. When someone tells you repeatedly that a thing is not worth looking at, he said, and they keep coming back to tell you again, the repetition itself tells you something. He looked at her steadily. I started paying closer attention every time Eleanor spoke about you. Whatever she said, I looked for the opposite and generally found it. Clara stared at him. That's an unusual interpretive method, she said. It's a reliable one, he said. In my experience. They stood in the garden in the warm afternoon, and Clara felt the full weight of that land on her. Not painfully, not with the compressed grief of years of misrepresentation, but with something that was almost lightness. The strange, disorienting lightness of a burden you have been carrying so long, you stopped noticing the weight, and then someone quietly takes it off your shoulders, and you feel the absence of it, before you feel the relief. I see, she said, which was not at all equal to what she meant. I think you do, he said, and they walked on. They were sitting on the low stone bench near the garden wall. She had not planned to sit, but the conversation had moved them there naturally. The way long conversations migrate toward stillness when he said, I want to ask you something directly. You can tell me if I'm moving too fast. I'll tell you, she said. What do you want? He said. Not what your circumstances have required. Not what your family expects. What do you, Clara Ashworth, want from your life? No one had asked her that. She knew this with the sudden clarity of a woman realizing something obvious that has somehow taken 24 years to surface. No one had ever sat beside her and asked what she actually wanted, as though her answer were data that mattered, information with which another person intended to do something. She felt the question move through her the way large important things move, not quickly, but completely reaching every part. I want, she said slowly, to be in a room where I don't have to manage my own smallness. She looked at her hands folded in her lap. I want to have a conversation and not spend half of my attention monitoring whether I'm being too much. I want my judgment to be consulted rather than managed. I want to read what I want to read, and think what I think and say what I think without it being described as a defect of character. She paused. And I want eventually what your aunt and her husband have. The 31 years of it. The silence that doesn't need to be filled because the two people in it already know they're not going anywhere. She had not planned to say that much. She had said it anyway. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I've been trying to find a way to say something to you since the night of the gathering. In the library when you told me you wanted to be known accurately and have that knowledge held with care. I've been carrying that. He looked at her. I'm not going to tell you what I feel. Not yet. It's too new and I don't want to say it wrong. But I want you to know that I am paying attention. To what you've just said. To all of it. Clara nodded. That's enough, she said. That's actually more than enough. It shouldn't be more than enough, he said with a flash of something not quite anger, but its quieter cousin directed inward, directed at the world that had made that response sufficient. It should be the baseline. Yes, she said, but it isn't, and you are. He looked at her with an expression she could read now, or was beginning to. It was the expression of a man whose careful, considered self-possession had reached its own edge and was working to stay on the right side of it. I'm going to call again, he said, next week, and the week after, if that's acceptable. It's acceptable, she said, and I'd like when you're willing for you to meet my mother properly. Not at a dinner, just at the house. Her and you with enough time for a real conversation. Clara thought about Mrs. Hartwell Sr. and her counting. 3 mentions. The real laugh, the frank assessment. I'd like that too, she said. He stood. She stood. They walked back toward the garden gate in the warm late afternoon light, and at the gate, he paused and turned and said, The dress. Clara looked at him. You wore the same one, he said. From the gathering. Yes, she said. On purpose. Yes, she said. He looked at her for a moment with something in his expression that was quiet and complete and entirely without performance. Good, he said. And meant it the way men mean things when they have stopped making things mean something other than what they are. He walked back to his horse. She stood at the garden gate and watched him go, and did not try to look like she wasn't watching, because she had decided that some moments didn't require management. She stood there until he was out of sight. Then she turned and walked back up the path toward the house. Eleanor was in the sitting room. She had been there long enough to have made a cup of tea that had gone cold beside her untouched, which told Clara she had been waiting with more difficulty than she had planned. She looked up when Clara came in. "Well," she said. Clara sat down across from her sister. She felt, and she searched for the accurate word, the same way she always searched for the accurate word. She felt solid. Not happy exactly, though that was underneath it. Solid. Grounded. The feeling of a woman who has been standing on uncertain ground for years and has finally found the place where the earth holds. "He's calling again next week," she said. Eleanor's breath went out slowly. "And," she said, "and he wants me to meet his mother properly. Not at a gathering, just the two of us." Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, her face had the expression of a woman arriving slowly and at some cost at a conclusion she had resisted. "His mother," Eleanor said. "He wants you to meet his mother." "Yes, Clara." Eleanor pressed her hand flat on the table between them, a gesture Clara recognized. It was the gesture their mother had used years ago when she was trying to contain something strong. "That isn't casual." "I know," Clara said. That is very deliberate." "He is a very deliberate man," Clara said. "I find it one of his most reliable qualities." Eleanor stared at her. Then something happened to Eleanor's face that Clara had not seen since they were girls, since before their mother died, before Eleanor had built the elaborate, careful structure of her current self. Something broke through. Not collapsed, not fallen apart, but broke through the way light breaks through cloud cover, sudden and complete, and slightly blinding if you weren't prepared for it. Eleanor pressed her hand harder on the table. "I was wrong about you," she said. Her voice was unsteady. "I have been wrong about you for a very long time, and I did damage with the wrongness. I know I did. I am asking you." She stopped. She had reached the edge of what she could say cleanly, and was standing there on that edge with more courage than Clara had ever seen her spend. "Eleanor," Clara said. "I'm sorry," Eleanor said. Just that. Just the two words without architecture or qualification. "I'm sorry." The sitting room was very quiet. Clara looked at her sister, at the woman who had spent 20 years being wrong about her in the particular way that people are wrong when their own pain requires it, and who was sitting across from her now with her hand flat on the table and her face broken open in the only honest way it knew. "I know," Clara said, quietly, without heat. "I know you are." She reached across the table and put her hand over her sister's. Eleanor made a sound, and Clara held her hand on the table in the sitting room of the house she had run for 3 years, while nobody noticed and said nothing else, because some things don't need words added to them. Some things are better honored with exactly the silence they have earned. That evening after supper, Clara went to her room and sat at the small desk where she had written her letters and opened her journal, the one she had kept since she was 16, the one she had never shown to anyone, the one that contained the accurate record of what her life had actually been, as opposed to the version being managed by others. She opened it to a blank page. She wrote the date. Then she wrote, "He asked me what I wanted. I told him. He listened." She stopped, read it back. Then she wrote, "I have been waiting for that question my entire life. I did not know I was waiting for it. I thought waiting implied hope, and I had stopped allowing myself hope because hope without evidence is simply suffering with a better name." She paused again. Then she wrote, "I have evidence now." She closed the journal. She sat in the quiet of her room and listened to the house, the small sounds of it, the settling of timbers, the faint wind outside, the distant voice of Margaret, saying something to Ruth on the floor below, and Eleanor's door closing with the soft finality of a woman going to bed early, which meant she was doing the kind of thinking that required the privacy of darkness. Clara sat in the quiet and let herself feel the fullness of the day. All of it. The letter, the garden, the question he had asked, the answer she had given. Eleanor's hand under hers on the table. The solid, grounded feeling of a life that was for the first time in a very long time pointing somewhere she had chosen. She was not naive. She knew that wanting something clearly was not the same as having it. She knew there were distances still to travel and uncertainties still to manage, and that the world had not reorganized itself simply because one man with good judgment had noticed her correctly. But she had been seen, accurately, carefully, without conditions, and she had said what she wanted out loud in the sunshine to a man who had listened with both hands open. That was not nothing. That was in fact everything she had not let herself want. She blew out the candle. She lay in the dark. She did not manage her emotions. She let them be exactly what they were. He came back the following Tuesday. Not Friday, as he had said. Tuesday 4 days early, which told Clara something she filed carefully and did not allow herself to overinterpret, though the effort required was considerable. She was in the middle of the household accounts when Ruth appeared in the doorway with the particular expression of a woman who is trying to deliver news without delivering an opinion along with it. "Mr. Hartwell, ma'am," Ruth said, "at the front." Clara set down her pen. She pressed both palms flat on the account book. She breathed in, breathed out, stood up, and said, "Please tell him I'll be a moment." She went to the small mirror in the hallway. She looked at herself for exactly 3 seconds. She straightened her collar. She walked to the front door. He was standing on the step with the same directness he always brought to spaces, not filling them, not performing in them, just occupying them with the complete presence of a man who had decided where he was going to stand and stood there. "You said Friday," she said. "I did," he said. "I came Tuesday instead. I'd apologize, but I'm not entirely sorry." "Why Tuesday?" "Because I have been sitting with something since Friday, and I have determined it doesn't improve with more sitting." He looked at her steadily. "May I come in?" She stepped back. He came in. They went to the sitting room, which was empty. Eleanor had taken Margaret to a visit at the Prewitt household that morning. Their father was in his study, conducting the elaborate performance of a man occupied by important matters, and Ruth had the discretion Clara had spent 3 years quietly cultivating in her. They sat. He did not wait. "I told you last week that I didn't want to say what I felt yet because it was too new, and I didn't want to say it wrong," he said. "I've determined that was an insufficient reason. The feeling isn't less clear for being new. I was using caution as a substitute for honesty, which I find on reflection unacceptable in myself." Clara's hands were very still in her lap. "All right," she said. "I am going to say something," he said, "and I want you to hear it completely before you respond. Will you do that?" "Yes," she said. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, the posture she had come to recognize as the one he assumed when he was dispensing with performance entirely. "I have been managing my own life very competently for 6 years," he said. "The estate, the legal work, my mother's comfort, my obligations to the tenants, all of it. And in that competent management, I have been without precisely knowing it alone in a specific way that has nothing to do with the people around me. Surrounded by people served, well respected, and alone in the way you are alone when no one in your daily life is operating at full capacity in your presence. When everyone is performing a slightly reduced version of themselves, because that's what the context requires." He looked at her. "And then you walked into my library and told me where Burke's argument broke," he said. "At full capacity, without adjustment, without checking first whether it was appropriate." He paused. "And I thought, there she is. That is what I have been missing. Not a conversation, not an intelligent woman. Specifically her." The sitting room was very quiet. Clara's heart was not under management. She let it not be. "I am not a man who speaks carelessly," he said. "You know that about me by now." "I know that about you," she said. "Then you understand what it means when I say I would like to ask your father for permission to court you formally." I am asking you first because I believe the correct sequence is to ask the person most directly affected before I ask anyone with nominal authority over the matter." He held her gaze. "Do I have your permission, Clara?" Her name. Not Miss Ashworth. Her name said the way you say a name when you have been thinking it privately long enough that saying it aloud feels both new and entirely familiar. She breathed. "You have my permission," she said. "And my yes. All of it." Yes. Something happened to his face. Not a performance of relief or happiness. Something quieter and more complete, the expression of a man who has been holding himself carefully for several weeks and has finally been told he can set it down. "Good," he said. "Good," she said. They sat in the sitting room in the particular silence of two people who have just said something irreversible and are quietly adjusting to the new shape of the world. Then she said, "You said it didn't improve with more sitting." "It didn't," he said. "How long were you sitting with it before Tuesday?" "Since the library," he said. "At the gathering?" Clara looked at him. "The first night," she said. "I asked Mrs. Pruitt your name before dinner," he said, as though this were the logical continuation of the same sentence. "I needed to know it." Clara thought about Mrs. Pruitt appearing at her elbow with 2 glasses of lemonade. About the careful, deliberate way that woman had delivered her information. She thought she knew. She was in it from the beginning. She thought, "I will send that woman the finest thank you letter ever composed in the state of Virginia." "I see," she said. "Do you?" he said. "Yes," she said. "I see entirely." He spoke to her father that same afternoon. George Ashworth received the conversation in his study with the expression of a man who has been handed something unexpected and is working rapidly to adjust his account of the world to accommodate it. Clara sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea she did not drink and listened to the silence of the house, and then the distant sound of her father's voice saying something she could not hear, and Adrian's voice responding with the same calm evenness it always had, and then silence again. Ruth appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Your father's asking for you, ma'am," she said. Clara stood. She walked down the hall. She knocked on the study door and went in. Her father was at his desk. Adrian was standing near the window. They both looked at her when she came in, and the particular quality of that double look told her everything about what had passed between them before she arrived. "Clara," her father said. He had the slightly dazed expression of a man recalibrating faster than he was comfortable with. "Mr. Hartwell has—" He stopped. Tried again. "He has expressed a very serious, He has my permission," Clara said. "I told him so before he came to speak with you. I wanted to be clear that my agreement preceded yours." Her father blinked. Adrian near the window said nothing, but she caught the movement at the corner of his mouth. "Quite right," her father said after a moment. "Quite right." He looked between them with the expression of a man who is revising a great deal of history very quickly and finding some of the revision uncomfortable. "Then yes. You have my blessing, Mr. Hartwell, both my blessing and my—" He stopped again. He looked at Clara, really looked at her with the complete and slightly startled attention of a man seeing something that has always been present and has simply not been observed. My sincere, Clara, It's all right, Father," she said quietly. He pressed his lips together. He nodded. It was not enough. They both knew that. Years of not enough do not dissolve in a single afternoon of better. But it was a beginning of something, and Clara had decided that she would receive beginnings for what they were, not as substitutes for what should have come earlier, but as what was available now, which was its own kind of grace. "Thank you," she said, to her father, simply. He nodded again. He looked at his desk. He was a man who had run out of the right words, which was perhaps the first honest thing he had offered her in years. She and Adrian left the study together, and in the hallway outside the closed door, he stopped and looked at her and said quietly, "You all right?" "Yes," she said, and meant it. "He should have seen you sooner," he said, low and direct and without editorializing. He should have, she said. But he sees me now. That's not nothing. Adrian looked at her for a moment. You are, he said slowly, the least bitter person I have ever met, given every reason available. Bitterness is expensive, she said. I've always had to be careful with my resources. He laughed. Then the real one, short and unguarded, the one that changed his face, and the sound of it in the quiet hallway, was one of the finest things Clara Ashworth had heard in her 24 years on Earth. Eleanor came home at 4. She came through the front door with Margaret behind her and stopped in the entrance hall and looked at Clara, standing there, and read something in Clara's face with the acute precision of a woman who had been studying that face for 24 years, and said before Clara had spoken a single word, "He came early." "Tuesday," Clara confirmed. Eleanor's breath went out. "And," she said. "He spoke to Father," Clara said. "He's been given permission to court me formally." The entrance hall was very quiet. Margaret made a sound. A small, genuine, startled sound of real happiness that she made no effort to manage, which was the most honest thing Clara had heard from her sister in years, and which cracked something open in Clara's chest that she had not known was still closed. "Clara," Margaret said. She crossed the distance between them and took Clara's hands in both of hers. Her eyes were bright. "Clara." "I know," Clara said. "I'm glad," Margaret said. I know I haven't." She stopped, pressed Clara's hands. "I'm glad, that's all. I'm glad." Clara held her sister's hands. "Thank you," she said. Eleanor had not moved from just inside the door. She was standing very still with her wrap still on her shoulders, looking at Clara, with an expression that contained more than Clara could fully read. Layers and layers of it. The complex topography of a woman arriving at a moment she had convinced herself would never come, or should never come, or could not come, for reasons that were more about Eleanor's own grief than about Clara's actual prospects. "Eleanor," Clara said. Her sister crossed the room in 3 steps and pulled Clara into an embrace that was not graceful, or managed, or architecturally precise. It was just desperate and real and entirely human. The embrace of a woman who has been wrong for a long time and knows it and is attempting in the only language left to her to say so. Clara held her. She felt Eleanor shaking very slightly. She felt how much it cost her. She felt underneath all of it the love that had always been there, tangled up in damage and fear, and the particular cruelty of people who hurt others most in the places they are most hurt themselves. "I'm sorry," Eleanor said into her shoulder. Again. 3rd time. Each time more complete than the last. "I know," Clara said. "I know you are." She held her sister until the shaking stopped. Then Eleanor stepped back, collected herself with the efficiency of a woman who has been maintaining composure under pressure for 20 years, pressed her handkerchief once to each eye and said, "Well, someone will need to see to a dress." Clara looked at her. "For calling occasions?" Eleanor said. "Proper ones. You cannot keep wearing—" She stopped. Something crossed her face. "Actually, wear whatever you choose. He's already made his position on that clear enough." "He has," Clara said. Eleanor smoothed her skirts. She straightened her spine. She was reassembling herself, which was what Eleanor always did. But the thing being reassembled was slightly different this time. Slightly more honest in its architecture. "I'd like to help," Eleanor said carefully. "With whatever comes next, if you'll let me." Clara looked at her oldest sister. At the woman who had shaped so much of what Clara had been required to survive. At the woman who was standing in the entrance hall of their shared house, offering what she had, which was not everything, and was not enough to undo the history, but was real, and was now. "Yes," Clara said. "I'll let you." The first formal calling visit happened on Friday, as originally planned, and it was different from Tuesday in the specific way that things are different when they have been officially named. There was a formality to it, her father present for the first portion, Eleanor and Margaret visible in adjacent rooms, in the way that families make themselves visible without being intrusive, the particular choreography of a household that has reorganized itself around a new reality. Adrian sat across from Clara in the sitting room and spoke with her for 2 hours about everything and nothing about the estate and his plans for the South Field. About a legal question Beale had raised that was interesting in its structural complexity. About a book she had mentioned in her second letter that he had since acquired, and was halfway through about her mother, whom she spoke of for the first time in his presence carefully and honestly. "She would have liked you," Clara said. "She liked people who said what they thought and meant it." "What happened to her?" he said. "The fever. The same year your father—" She stopped. He looked at her. "The same year," he said. "I didn't know that was a connection until much later," she said. "I stored it away somewhere. It didn't seem like it had a practical application." "And now," he said. "Now, it seems like the kind of thing that existed before either of us understood what it was connecting," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I went to 3 county funerals that summer. My father's was the last. At the second one, I don't remember whose it was. I was too full of my own grief to keep track. I saw a young woman standing apart from everyone, standing very straight, looking at nothing in particular. She had the posture of a person who has decided that falling apart is not available to her." Clara looked at him. "I remember thinking," he said, "that whoever she was carrying something alone that she should not have been carrying alone." He paused. "I don't know if that was you. I think it might have been." Clara felt the full weight of that land somewhere deep and central. "It might have been," she said barely above a whisper. He reached across the distance between them and put his hand briefly over hers on the arm of the chair, not grasping, not possessing, just present, just warm, just the simple animal comfort of a human hand, acknowledging another human hand, and then withdrew it. "You're not carrying it alone anymore," he said. "If you'll permit that." "I permit it," she said. And that was that. The county found out the way. The county found out everything, through the concatenated whispers of people who had nothing more important to track, accelerated by the particular fascination that attaches to a story that defies expectation. It was not the expected daughter, not Eleanor, who was beautiful and managed and had spent years positioning herself. Not Margaret, who was charming and soft-featured and knew how to make men feel interesting. The leftover daughter. The quiet one. The one in the faded dress at the far end of the table. The reactions were various. Mrs. Pruitt, when she heard, smiled with the satisfied expression of a woman who has watched a long game reach its correct conclusion. She said to her husband, "I knew before dinner." And her husband said, "Of course you did," with the fond resignation of 30 years, and she refilled her wine. The county mothers with eligible daughters processed their responses privately and variably, and mostly kept their conclusions to themselves, because Adrian Hartwell had always been the kind of man who did what he intended, and was not moved by the opinion of people whose opinion he had not solicited. The county itself watched and waited, and within approximately 6 weeks, reached the collective determination that there was something in Clara Ashworth, something that had always been there unaccounted for in the general estimate that the Hartwell name would not be diminished by. There was one exception. Her name was Mrs. Catherine Doyle. She was the wife of a tobacco merchant, a woman of aggressive social ambition, and the specific cruelty of someone who had climbed far enough to be afraid of falling and dealt with that fear by pushing at anyone who appeared to be rising unexpectedly. She attended the next public gathering, a summer social at the Beale estate, 3 weeks after the courting became common knowledge, and she arrived with a prepared campaign. Clara was standing near the east side of the room alone for a moment when Mrs. Doyle materialized. "Miss Ashworth," she said, with the warm precision of a woman delivering a social missile wrapped in silk. "How unexpected. We've hardly seen you at these occasions before." "I've attended most of them," Clara said. "You may not have noticed." "Well?" A small laugh. "You were always so quieter. Less present, one might say." She tilted her head with the practiced sympathy of someone enjoying themselves. I do hope you're not finding the attention taxing. It can be quite a change, when circumstances shift. People aren't always a pause for maximum effect. Kind about sudden changes of fortune. No, Clara agreed pleasantly. They aren't. And of course everyone is wondering. Mrs. Doyle dropped her voice into the register of shared confidence. What it is exactly that he sees. Given that your sisters have always been so much more visible, one wonders what a man of his discernment could possibly— Mrs. Doyle, Clara said. The woman stopped. I spent 3 years running a household alone while being consistently described as the fragile, sensitive, unremarkable daughter, Clara said. Her voice was even, not raised, not heated, just completely, calmly direct. I kept the accounts managed, the staff maintained the property, and conducted myself with honesty in every interaction. The man you're questioning saw exactly that precisely because he was paying attention rather than consulting the consensus. She met the woman's eyes without blinking. I don't know what you were hoping I'd say. But that is the accurate answer. You may do with it what you like. Mrs. Doyle's face went through several stages. Clara turned away. She walked to the other side of the room where Adrian was in conversation with Beale and the commissioner, and she came to stand beside him. Not behind him, not waiting to be acknowledged beside him. And he moved without looking up, the small natural movement of a man making space for a person. He had been expecting the easy unconscious geometry of two people who have already begun to orbit the same center. He finished his sentence to Beale. Then he looked at her. All right, he said. Perfectly, she said. Something in her face told him more than that, because he was the kind of man who looked at what was there rather than what was presented. He looked at Mrs. Doyle across the room, who was still reassembling her expression. She said something, he said. I handled it, Clara said. I know you did, he said. Not, I'm sorry. Not, I'll address it. Just the clean acknowledgment of a man who understood that she did not require protection. Only occasionally, the quiet confirmation that she had been seen handling it. Beale, who had the attorney's gift for processing information that was not explicitly offered, looked between them and said to the commissioner, as I was saying about the survey legislation, and steered the conversation smoothly away, which Clara filed away as another mark in Beale's considerable favor. The visit to Mrs. Hartwell Sr. happened on a Wednesday morning 2 weeks later. Clara arrived alone. She had insisted on it. Eleanor had offered twice to accompany her, and Clara had declined twice with the same gentle firmness, because she understood that this was a conversation that required exactly 2 people, and that adding a third would change its architecture in ways that would not serve any of them. Mrs. Hartwell met her in the sitting room off the library, not the formal reception room. The smaller one, which Clara noted with the precise attention she brought to all spatial choices, because spatial choices are almost always also relational ones. Tea was already poured. Sit down, child, Mrs. Hartwell said. Then immediately, you're not a child. I keep saying that to people I like. It's a term of affection, not a judgment. I understand, Clara said and sat. He told me about Tuesday, Mrs. Hartwell said. She handed Clara her tea and settled back with the comfortable directness of a woman who has long since stopped spending her time on approaches. He came home, and he was different. I've known my son for 32 years, and I can tell you the precise quality of different that he was. What quality? Clara said. Settled, Mrs. Hartwell said. He's been unsettled for 6 years, since his father. He managed everything, did it well. The estate is better than it's ever been, but he had the quality of a man who is operating at capacity and is tired of doing it entirely alone. She looked at Clara over her tea. You know that quality. I know it from the inside, Clara said. Yes, Mrs. Hartwell said. I know you do. She set her cup down. I want to ask you something directly, and I want you to answer me in the same way. All right, Clara said. Do you love him? Mrs. Hartwell said. Not are you impressed by him. Not are you grateful for his attention. Not is he kind and intelligent and more than you were taught to expect. Do you love him? Clara looked at the woman across from her, at the clear, measuring eyes that had been counting mentions and watching dinner tables and making real laughs out of unexpected answers. I am getting there, she said. Honestly, deliberately, with both eyes open. She held Mrs. Hartwell's gaze. The honest answer is that I have never in my life had sufficient information to know what I actually feel about someone, because the conditions required to feel it accurately have never existed before. I am learning in real time what it is to be known correctly. The feeling I have when I am with him is solid and warm and true. She paused. I believe that is the beginning of love. I believe it will deepen into it. I am not going to claim the full word before I've earned it honestly, because I do not use words carelessly. But yes, I am on my way there. Mrs. Hartwell looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, Good. That's the right answer. She picked up her tea. The women who claim certainty too fast frighten me. Love built on certainty claimed before it's earned falls apart the first time it's tested. She sipped. Yours won't. No, Clara said. It won't. They had tea for 2 hours and talked about books and the estate and the weather and Clara's mother and Adrian's father and the land survey legislation, which Mrs. Hartwell had opinions about, that made Clara want to take notes. At the end of it, Mrs. Hartwell stood and walked her to the door of the sitting room and stopped there. He needs someone who will tell him when he's wrong, she said. He's usually right, which has given him habits. He needs someone who will find the places where he isn't and say so cleanly. I've already corrected him twice, Clara said. On Burke. Mrs. Hartwell's mouth curved. Good, she said. Keep doing it. She kissed Clara once on the cheek, not a social kiss, a real one, brief and deliberate and entirely warm. Clara walked out of the Hartwell house into the summer afternoon and stood for a moment on the gravel path with the sun on her face and thought, This is mine. This is real. This is mine. She said it 3 times privately because it was the kind of true thing that needed saying more than once before it would stay. The engagement was announced in September. The summer had moved them there with the particular momentum of 2 people who had been honest with each other from the beginning, and found therefore that there were fewer obstacles than usual. Fewer misunderstandings to untangle, fewer manufactured distances to cross. They had read together, and argued together, and walked the garden and the estate, and talked for hours about everything that mattered, and found consistently that what mattered to one of them mattered to the other. He had said the word love first on a Tuesday evening in August. There was something about Tuesdays for them. They had joked about it, the first real joke between them. The kind of joke that only 2 people who share a specific history can make, sitting in the library at the Hartwell estate, with the evening coming in through the window and a book open and unread on the table between them. I love you, he said. No preamble, no ceremony. Just the fact delivered cleanly. I know, she said. I love you too. I've known it for about 3 weeks, but I wanted to be certain before I said it. He looked at her. 3 weeks, he said. I told you I don't use words carelessly, she said. He laughed. The real one. Unguarded, complete, the one that had been one of the finest sounds she'd heard in her life and had not diminished with repetition. He had proposed formally the following week in the garden at Ashworth Manor, which was right, because that was where they had begun on a Friday afternoon, with the sun warm, and the accounts left unfinished on the desk inside. She said yes before he finished the sentence, which was not careless. It was simply that she had already said everything that needed to be said over the course of 3 months, and the sentence, when it finally arrived, was not a surprise. It was a confirmation. The difference mattered. She was a woman who understood the difference. So, on the morning the engagement was formally announced, Clara sat at her small desk one last time and opened her journal. She found the entry from the night of the garden visit. She read it. He asked me what I wanted. I told him. He listened. Then I have evidence now. She read it twice. Then she turned to a new page. She wrote the date. She wrote, "I wore a faded dress to a gathering, and a man with honest eyes asked my name before he knew whether I was worth asking after." Everything that followed was simply the consequence of two people willing to see each other clearly and say so. She stopped. She thought about Burke and obligation and the direction it flows. She thought about 31 years of real silence. She thought about Eleanor in the entrance hall shaking and sorry and trying. She thought about Margaret's bright eyes and held hands. She thought about her father's face when he said Clara and couldn't finish. She thought about Mrs. Hartwell counting 3 mentions. She thought about Beale saying observation holds with the finality of a verdict. She thought about a girl standing alone at a funeral in the summer of 1814, carrying something alone that she should not have been carrying alone, standing very straight, looking at nothing in particular, not knowing that someone nearby had seen her and thought she shouldn't have to do that. She wrote, "I was never lacking. I was simply surrounded for a time by people who needed me to be less than I was. And when someone finally looked with clear eyes and an honest mind, there was nothing to reveal, nothing to transform, nothing to rescue or restore. I was already here. I had always been here. He simply had the grace to look." She closed the journal. She pressed her hand flat on the cover for a moment, the way her mother had pressed her hand on the table, the way Eleanor had pressed her hand on the table, the way some gestures pass through families, like water through stone, slowly and completely and permanently. She stood up. She walked to the window. Outside, the Virginia morning was bright and warm and entirely real, and somewhere 11 miles away, Adrian Hartwell was beginning his day on his estate, and in 3 months she would begin hers beside him, and it would not be a rescue, and it would not be an escape, and it would not be a correction of anything, because she had never been wrong. It would simply be what it was, a life freely chosen by a woman who had always known her own value and had finally found the one thing she had been waiting for, without knowing she was waiting someone else who knew it too. Clara Ashworth stood at her window in the Virginia morning, and she was at last entirely and completely and irrevocably herself. That was the beginning and the end, and everything that mattered in between.